Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
Welcome to the Shaker class of 1974 50th High School Reunion and our conversation today.
Oh, yeah, dale.
Author of Dreamtown, Shaker Heights, and the Quest for Racial Equity. I'm Carol Malone, your host, producer of Neighbor Up Spotlight podcast, and the grant maker with Neighborhood Connections. Laura Meckler is the national education writer for the Washington Post, where she covers news, politics, policies, and people shaping American schools. Her honors include the Neiman Fellowship, the Livingston Award for National Reporting, and she was part of a team that won the George Polk Award for Justice Reporting for a series on the life of George Floyd. She grew up in the Sussex neighborhood and attended Shaker schools K through 12. Welcome, we've got a lot to cover. We will have a brief conversation, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. So, how did the idea for the book come about, and the title?
First of all, just thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be with you all. It's like so clear how much joy there is in this class and how happy everybody is to be together. And so I'm thrilled to be part of your celebration this weekend. I was at the time that I started the first idea for this I was working at the Wall Street Journal. I had just been given a new beat covering American demographics, changing demographics, which had something to do with race. And so I was sort of just casting about for ideas for stories. And then one day it just sort of hit me, it might be interesting to write about the Shaker schools. And I just sort of did some poking online and found this video of the superintendent giving a State of the Schools speech where he says, "We've been talking about racial equity for a long time, now it's time to do something about it." And I thought, what? Now it's time to do something? Haven't you been doing something about it for a long time? What are you talking about? And so that sort of got me interested, and I started going deeper and deeper. It ended up being, long story short, I ended up moving to the Washington Post, ended up being a big story in the Washington Post. As it turns out, I changed beats a few times. I went back to covering politics, and then I came to the Post where I was covering education, national education issues. So it was sort of made sense in this new beat. I had never really been thinking about writing a book, but then for the first time in my life, in fact, I sort of actively decided it was a bad idea. It sounded totally unpleasant from everything I'd ever heard from anybody about it. But then this one kind of caught my eye, and I thought, this is actually a subject that I think is something that would be book worthy and that I might be the right person to do. So that's why I did it. The title of the book originally comes from a sentence in a story that was written in Cosmo magazine in 1963 about Shaker Heights. It was the reason they were writing it was because at the time in the 1960 census, Shaker Heights was the wealthiest city in America. And they wrote this story that basically described suburban opulence. And there was a line that said, "This is a story of an American dream town come true." And so I was just really thinking about that idea of dream town, an American dream town. And then just a few months after that article appeared, Dr. King spoke on the National Mall at Lincoln Memorial about a different sort of American dream. So I just thought this is a place that is kind of trying to make both of those dreams come true, both that suburban dream and also this idea of a place where we're not judged by the color of our skin. So that was it. That was the origin of the title. Also, I'll just say one more thing about the title, which is it is really not meant to imply that this is a place where some sort of utopia, which Shaker has been described in many iterations over the years as the perfect place. It's a dream place. I view the word dream in the title much more as a verb than as an adjective. This is a dream town. This is a place where people are dreaming.
So tell us about the Van Schweers and others and Shaker's journey from a community with racial covenants to a community with integration aspirations.
Well, the Van Schweerdens had no aspirations for integration. In fact, they're probably spinning in their graves for the last several decades, to be quite honest. But they founded this. They were two of the weirdest people you're ever going to read about, to be quite honest. We probably don't have time to go into their full story, but they were developers. They took this land, which had been abandoned by the Shakers, the religious sect that had been here in the 1800s, and they began developing it, and the idea was for it to be an escape from the city for wealthy Clevelanders who were looking for sort of the best of the best. And that was their vision. They had, not initially they didn't have covenants on the deeds, but they later decided, added them, got a lot of families to add these covenants to their deeds, which was actually spurred by an emergency situation, what they viewed as an emergency when a Black doctor and his family moved into Shaker. The response was, what are we going to do? And they added these covenants, which basically gave the Van Sweringen Company veto power over any sale of property. And so that was their vision. They went on, they became very prominent. Actually, they ended up, they were trying to build a rapid transit to downtown. In order to complete the line, they needed just a few miles of track, which they ended up buying an entire railroad for, which then they ended up buying multiple other railroads, became quite prominent nationally. So in terms of how it then morphed into a place that was, aspiring to integration, it was not part of the plan by any means, but then, a few Black families found a way. It was a very complicated way. We can talk more about that if you want, but through a lot of, in fact, we have one of the people, a relative of somebody who was involved with that, helping them get in through really subterfuge by properties that were first as part of the Ludlow neighborhood that was in the City of Cleveland Shaker Heights schools. And the difference was, at first it was the same. There was a big meeting at the Ludlow Elementary School in 1955 where it was the same words were used, undesirables. How do we keep undesirables out? And they were plotting, and the difference is that some people left that meeting saying they felt really uncomfortable. They didn't like the way this was. So 30 years later, things had changed. And then when John and Dorothy Pegg, a lawyer, and his wife were building a house in Ludlow, and it was firebombed. Most people have heard this story in January 1956. And the response, though, this time from many white neighbors was they were horrified. And they showed up to help with cookies and coffee for the workers who were cleaning it up, and they made a statement about that. So, and that after that ultimately led to the Ludlow Community Association, which was worked to embrace integration, and then that ethos ultimately spread to other neighborhoods and then to the city itself.
So now, who was Alan Geisman Jr. and why was his research paper so significant, of which you were nice to send me a copy? So this is a very interesting story.
So one of the things we're now fast forwarding our story quite a bit. One of the things that Shaker Heights schools have struggled with over the years has been the racial achievement gap and the disproportionate placement of Black and white kids into advanced and regular and lower level classes. And this has been something that's been an issue for a long time and is still an issue today. And so in my research, I sort of unpacked how this came about and how the district approached it over the years. I was actually quite surprised to find in 1980 there was an Urban League report quite critical of the Shaker and the Cleveland Heights, University Heights schools, Heights High School, the same thing, about really calling out the system as racist in their view. The school district defended it vociferously at the time. But I would say on this topic, and frankly any topic that I came upon, the single most surprising document or fact that I found that I didn't know about going in was in the basement of this school. I was going through boxes and I was looking through a bunch of documents on a completely different topic, and there at the very back of the box was this research paper by Alan Geismer, which was a wholesale takedown of the level system as having evolved into a racist system, not intended that way, but that's how it had evolved, he wrote. And the thing that surprised me was not that he wrote this, not that he came to those conclusions, it was when it was written. This paper was written in 1969, which took my breath away. In fact, it still does. I'm both incredibly shocked and also very saddened by it, to be honest. That this was already on the radar that early. His father was on the school board, which is probably why he was interested in writing about this sort of thing. I did talk to him. He actually did not remember writing this paper, but it was an incredible thing. The idea that the system had, quote, evolved into something racist by 1969. He quotes the assistant principal of the high school as saying it's their biggest problem, the level system is their biggest problem. So this is a time when there was, the percentage of Black students at Shaker Heights High School was, pretty low compared to certainly where it would go So anyway, that's what his paper was. And I actually got to meet, he lives in Boston, he came to a book talk I gave in Boston, I got to meet him, which was great.
And his research paper is entitled Counseling Services, the Level System, and Racial Polarity, if you're interested in it. And you can get it from Megan Hayes at the Shaker Library. She's a historical library. What are some of the initiatives that Shaker has deployed to address the academic achievement gap?
I mean, there have been so many things that Shaker has done over the years. You know, it's not a problem. I mean, everybody knew about this. In fact, like, you know, Mark Freeman, who was the longtime superintendent of the Shaker schools and worked in the school system before that in other positions, you know, he always says, like, yeah, we know this is a problem. Like, do you have a solution? They've tried many things. There's free tutoring after school, you know, that frankly, I wish my kids had free tutoring. I mean, that's a great thing that they have. There's been study circles, efforts to help kids develop study habits, other Black kids working together. There's a summer program called Bridges that helps prepare students of color to take AP history in particular the next year. And in some past years, it's been for some other courses as well. There's just been a lot of work over time on this issue. So usually focused on how do we encourage more students of color, specifically Black students, into taking higher level classes. For instance, one of the initiatives was an open enrollment system. So let's make it explicit that we're not gatekeeping. Anyone can take any class that they want. If you want, your parents think you can handle it, go ahead. Unfortunately, that policy had somewhat of a unintended consequence, which is what ended up happening was a lot of white students who had not been placed in the advanced classes took advantage of that and put themselves into advanced classes. And then that sort of actually made the problem worse because then there were fewer white kids in the regular classes, and then the ones that were left were they're looking around saying, well, do I belong here? I'm, one of only a few white kids. And so then they, maybe even if they didn't belong or didn't even necessarily want to, might feel like they could. And because most of the white families have more resources than most, not all, it's not entirely true, but today that's as a general statement, there is definitely a racial wealth gap in Shaker. And they might have the resources to, okay, you take the advanced class, but we'll get you tutoring to help you through it. And so the problem has grown wider. But this is definitely something, and there are other things I'm not thinking of at this very moment, but there are definitely a lot of initiatives that have been tried over the years. And I should add, the biggest one of late is actually a very significant detracking or de-leveling system where the kids of multiple abilities are combined in the same classrooms. I was fairly shocked when I started doing my reporting to realize that starting in 5th grade, they were dividing kids up into what was called enriched and regular. This was for both English language arts and math. And they were racially polarized right from the beginning. So really when kids were 10 years old, their sort of course was being set, which struck me as very young for this kind of tracking to start. And they did, that is no longer the case here. And in fact, all the way up through sort of early high school, there are mixed ability classes. We can talk more about that. This has been rocky, but it's something that the district is committed to and is still happening today.
For the next question, I just want to read something from your book. In chapter 6, you talked about a community meeting held at Byron Junior High School in 1969 with 700 in attendance and the overtly racist title, How the Blacks Are Changing Our School. At the meeting, the student asked Dr. Lawson, how are you dealing with racism of teachers at Byron? His response, he doubted such an attitude was widespread. In chapter 9, you quote Terry Pollock as saying, a significant number of teachers at the high school were overtly racist, referring to Black students using ugly racial epithets. In your conversations with Black students and parents, what was surprising to you as they shared their experiences with the Shaker school system?
Well, there's a lot in that question. I just want to give a little, I will answer your question. As a reporter, I do not like people who don't answer the question, so I will definitely but I just want to say about Dr. Lawson, Jack Lawson was the superintendent from the mid-60s to the mid-70s. He's the one who was responsible for the busing plan, the original voluntary school busing plan, which really set the schools on the path that they're on today. And he's a very good example of what I refer to in this book as sort of the messy middle, which is that people are not sort of heroes and villains. People are not all good or all bad. There's like generally, this is a story of people trying and doing their best and making mistakes. And Dr. Lawson is a good example of that. He did some amazing things and he also had some blind spots. So I just want to say that about Dr. Lawson. I think that Terry Pollock was referring to, at that time, that was several years ago. I don't think he would have said that about the staff at the time when he retired. Okay, having said that, in my conversations with Black students, alumni, and parents and teachers, I expected to hear stories of bias and discrimination, but I was quite surprised by how ubiquitous they were. Virtually every single Black student, alumni, and parent who I talked to had a story of lowered expectations, of feeling like they didn't get what their kids needed or what they needed. And even many of them who thrived, who had very good experiences, who sometimes came back here to raise their own kids here. This is not people who were bitter and hated it and thought that Shaker was a failure or anything like that. But they all have a story. Like every one of them has, and it didn't take much to bring it out.
Right.
It's like everybody had a story like this, which tells me that this was widespread and perhaps unintentional, but not mindful. And so these stories look like parent goes in to talk to the teacher, and the teacher says to this parent who has, like, I think it was a third grader, like, oh, she's reading. And they're like, yeah, we know she's reading, like, she's a great reader, like, how are we gonna get her to the next level? And the teacher was like, well, aren't you happy with how well she's doing already? They're like, well, no, we have like high expectations for our kids. Why don't you? It was stories along those lines. People who had to fight to get into a higher level reading group, say in elementary school. Or so one story, he told me the story. This was a kid who went on to major success. He went to Duke and then the University of Michigan Law School, very successful guy. He was taking a typing class during summer school, and a principal, assistant principal, or a principal came up to him in the hallways, and basically, he's Black, and he basically said something to the effect of, well, don't worry about that class that you failed. You're gonna make it up this summer, and you're gonna be just fine back on track. Just assume that he was there to retake a class he had failed. And he says, I'm here for typing, so I don't need that speech. And he, obviously he went on to have a very successful academic career, and it was fine. But he remembers that. And how do you feel? How does it feel if you're in that situation with something that I have personally never had to deal with? When somebody is making assumptions about you, and then maybe that gets in your head, So I think it happens a lot more than a lot of us would like to think or do think.
I just want to share, you said unintentional, and then some things were intentional. So I just want to share one of my own little stories. Senior year last semester, I had a teacher here, I'm not going to mention his name, but he said we could do a report in anything you wanted to do. So I chose to do my paper on Miles Davis, to which he told me that I couldn't write the paper because Miles Davis hadn't done anything noteworthy in music. So I wrote the paper anyway. He gave me an F on the paper. My parents came up to school, and we sat there and talked. And so during the conversation, he put his hands over his ears and then said to my parents, "You're yelling at me. Stop yelling at me." And so we looked at each other and said, okay, we all know where this is going. So long story short, he said, well, I'll change her grade. And he changed my grade to a D, which remains in my report card to this day. Then my counselor my senior year, when in junior high school, when I went to my counselor, she told me, I said I wanted to be a dental hygienist. She laughed in my face. I told my parents, I'm never going to a counselor again. So I said, okay, senior year, let me go talk to my counselor. So my senior year, my counselor says to me, and I quote, "You're not four-year college material. You'll never make it. So when I got my letter of acceptance to Boston University, I literally went in her office and I slapped it down on her desk. And she looked at it. I said, "What's this?" I said, "Read it." And she said, "I said, read it." Then I snatched it off the desk, sauntered on off her out the office. And then by the last month of school, every time I saw her in the hallway, I made her talk to me. "Hey, good morning, how you doing?" So, some things potentially
I mean, so this is a perfect example. Everybody has a story, you know, and yours came out all great. You know, you went to Boston University, had an incredibly successful life, but I do worry about people who had that happen and
Right.
it wasn't what followed.
Right, exactly. So, have you received negative feedback for revealing some uncomfortable truths about Shaker?
For the most part, no, not really. Maybe they just don't share it with me. But people who have negative things to say, that's possible. There are some people, a small handful, I would say, who don't necessarily appreciate the fact that a white person is writing about race and writing about the experience of Black people, and I do understand that. And to that, I say basically, number one, I don't think that people of color can be the only people talking about race in this country. Like, we all need to engage. Number two, this is a story about integration, so it's really about all of us. And number three, this book may not be for you, and that's okay. Like, if that's how you feel, I respect it, you know? So, so that is one piece that I have gotten from a few people, sort of kind of like, that I'm not the right person to tell the story. So, but here's the thing, is like, this story of Shaker has been told many times. There have been documentaries, there have been academic work, and it will be told again. You know, this isn't the last word. So, you know, and as it should be. I you know, but I did think a lot about that comment, you know, before and after. So that I have heard that, but not so much. I have gotten the question a few times, like, are people going to be upset that I'm like kind of taking off the veneer or whatever. Right. But I think that most people, I think people who live in the community today are pretty aware. There's a pretty active conversation. So I don't think that people are, you know, but it's more like people like graduates, people like us. Like, I frankly had the rose-colored glasses on for a long time before I started looking at it as a reporter. And the way I really view my role as an author here is that I am kind of combining both the love I have for this community, which is real, and I'm cheering, like, I'm clear about the fact that I want it to succeed. I'm not unbiased in that sense, but I also did approach this as a reporter, so as a journalist, and I'm trying, you know, to tell hard truths where there are truths to be told.
Well, I think you did a really great job, and I think everyone should really read the book. I just also want to say that there are still many stories to tell, so I just want to share with everyone that I'm really creating the Shaker African American Oral History Project. So as Black students over the years, we've had this conversation numerous times. So over here, there's a pad if you want to drop in your business card, you want to put your name and information over here, I'll be more than happy to get back in touch with you. How has writing this book personally impacted you, and what do you want people to learn from this history? I mean, it's been an amazing experience, to be honest. It was a little over a year ago that it was published, and I've had the chance to be in conversation with so many thoughtful people, yourself included, and it's been such a thrill for me, because writing a book is a very solitary process. So the opportunity that I've had to really talk about it has been great, and I've had really an enormous number of people reach out to me through email or through my website or in other ways to just tell me that this story meant something to them. So that's been really satisfying, you know, to be honest. What was the second part of your question? Two-part question. What do you want people to learn from this history?
Yes, what I want people to learn is two things. Like, one thing is that, like, you know, we're living in a country where most people are not even trying, right? And so I do think that this is hopefully gives people not so much, you know, obviously Shaker alumni may be my core audience here, I'm most likely to read the book, But there are other people too, and I would like them to see this and challenge their way of thinking about their own decisions and about their own choices, about where they send their kids to school and where they choose to live and how they work in their own communities. Like, I want that. And the other thing I want people to take away, again, is that idea of this no heroes and no villains. Like, this is not about, there are a few people in here who are like pretty
Hardcore.
yeah, like you're like, I don't really like that guy. Like, and that's okay. But for the most part, like, I think when you look at this story, you see like the Van Swearingen brothers. Like, do we look back at them and say, well, how horrible they were, these restrictions they had, and the racism, and yet they're also responsible for the beauty in this community, which so many people appreciate, and the winding roads, and the trees, and the fact that you don't see a factory right next to a school. Like, there's like beautiful things there too. So like, this is a story of nuance, and I think that too often in our world, and often when we're talking about hard questions like race, like, it is like, you're the bad guy, you're the good guy, and that's not real. Like, that isn't the reality, and that's what I hope people will take away.
What can other communities learn from Shaker's quest for racial equity? Is it a success story or one still in the making?
Well, I think I just sort of spoke to that a second ago, but yes, I mean, it's definitely, what is success? I guess that's the question. What is success, okay? Like, success may never be achieved if we view success in through certain metrics or it's more about the quest. Like, the journey is the success in some ways. And I really did like struggle with this question as I was writing the book. Like, what is my conclusion here? Like, is this a failure? On some level, you could argue maybe this is a failure. They've been trying for a long time and not succeeded. And so a couple people who've reviewed the book, that's sort of what they have said. They've come away with this and said, look, this has been decades, and there's still this huge racial achievement gap, and so I guess, at some point, let's just call it a failure. Like, but that is not really how I feel, though. I really feel like this still is a community, and I've spent a lot of time, I don't live here, I live in DC, but I come back here a lot. My parents live here, I have friends who live here, and working on the book, I came back a real lot. And, talked to a lot of people. I did, I think I counted up like more than 250 interviews for this book, some people multiple times, and people are really care about this and are working towards this and are drawn to the community because they want this. And I view that in and of itself, and the fact that this is still work that's going on, that is a measure of success in and of itself.
So now we'll take a few questions from the audience. Anyone have a question?
About parents who are regular with interest. I feel like I didn't follow any news since 1974. I've seen all the efforts that were made since then trying to implement another struck me. Now, completely separately, I read The Genius of Israel by Dan Seymour, where he talked about how, my question is going to be like, that thing that they tried in Israel didn't seem to be something that was ever tried in Shaker. And I wondered if it might have any promise, which was, instead of measuring individual achievement, they would measure like the whole class achievement. So the students would be responsible collectively for making sure that all the students understood the material. So the smart kids would have to, tutor on the spot the other kids until they all got it. And I just wondered whether that was something that ever came up or might be considered.
So in each grade, everybody got the same grade at the end?
As I recall,
Yeah.
And they weren't measuring the success of the class they weren't measuring the success of each individual person as I read it,
Yeah.
but rather you're a group and you have to together succeed.
Mm-hmm.
Now you guys make it happen.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of that before, and I don't think that has ever been tried in Shaker. I suspect there would be a lot of pushback to that from the higher achieving kids, parent who want to get into Ivy League schools and don't want, even if they got the whole class to a B. Well, but my kid got an A, that would probably be, I suspect, very controversial. It makes a degree of sense, I suppose, but I do think that there are elements of that are relevant here. One element is that in mixed ability classes, one of the arguments against is like, well, kids who go faster are going to be pulled down by other kids. Mm-hmm. But an argument in the other direction is that sometimes you do end up with someone who's already understood something, explaining it to somebody else, and that has benefits for both kids.
Right, exactly.
And in fact, I witnessed that, and there's a scene in the book about that in a math class in the middle school where there were two girls, and one was struggling with this worksheet, and the other was sort of very patiently explaining it to her, how it worked. And I asked the girl who was doing the explaining afterwards, like, well, what was this like for you? And she said exactly what experts say, although I'm sure she didn't know that. She said, well, when you explain it to someone else, it gets into your own head better. Right. And there is truth to that. So that speaks to that, but that isn't like the system, or that isn't required. I will say also, this isn't this is where I thought you were going, but is that for a long time, that is kind of how Shaker viewed its own measurement was, we're not going to look at individuals, we're going to look at the average. How people did as a whole, and that always looked pretty good because the kids who were struggling, that was being masked by the average. So, which is a problem. You don't really want that. You want to be able to focus on the kids who are struggling because, averages can mask that, so. But I don't think they've tried that.
Thanks.
You know what I want to do? I want to just sit this one. And if you could just come up here and ask a question into the mic, because we are recording this. We're recording this. Yes. All right.
I'll repeat the question.
Okay. You can say it.
You can say it. Go ahead.
I was wondering, what are some of the things happening now that give you hope?
So the question was, what's happening now that gives me hope? I should say that, not only was the book published a year ago, but I had to turn in my copy of the book 2 years ago. So I haven't been doing active, although the paperback edition that just came out does have some updates that happened since the publication of the hardback. So I think that when you, I do think that the detracking initiative has potential to do well. In the book, I'm pretty critical of how it was implemented during COVID and the comeback from COVID. I don't think it was. I don't think it was well handled. But I do think that the overall philosophy behind it has potential. So the jury, I think, is still out on that. So I'm going to be watching. Personally, I'm interested to see whether that gets the job done, what they're hoping for. I'm hopeful about the fact that after that was implemented, the enrollment numbers appeared to be still pretty stable. There didn't appear to be a lot of white flight out of the district, which is something I was looking at. So, because anecdotally you hear about that, but it's hard to know whether that's just anecdotal or whether that's really a trend. So I didn't really see any evidence of that happening. So I buy that. That might not sound very hopeful that you didn't see something bad happen, but I think that that's a statement of support for the schools and what they're trying to do, which is a good thing. I also was watching the fact these are all things that were updated for the paperback, of the fact that there was a big school facilities plan that was on the ballot. And that was an opportunity for people to essentially vote, express their opposition to the schools, both in terms of not just about the facilities, but it could be about anything. If you're mad, it's not too hard to come up with a justification to vote against more taxes. So, and in fact, the opponents made that case explicitly, we don't have confidence in them. But in fact, this levy did pass with almost 60% of the vote, which was pretty much in line with past levies. So what all of this tells me together is that this is a community that is kind of sticking with this and is still supportive of this work that's going on. So I do it doesn't mean that, again, that success has been quote unquote achieved, but it does mean that people are still in the boat. Like, you need to be in the boat, otherwise it just doesn't work.
Hey, I was really excited on the page where you said, unless you were in choir or band, because the truth is that my choir experience was the most diverse for me, and lifelong friends established, and appreciation and respect for each other. So I was interested in the fact, I thought, I was going to see more about that in the book, and I don't think I saw a lot about how the arts affected diversity within a school that was having so much issues with. Is that clear?
Yeah, she's talking about how she had a very multiracial experience and diverse experience in choir. Why didn't I write more about that kind of thing? And I've actually also, another feedback I've been getting is, why didn't I write more about the racial segregation of sports teams, which tend to be very, very divided, where you have like black kids on the basketball team and white kids on the soccer team. So so extracurricular activities probably is an area where I probably could have gone deeper. But yeah, so we're definitely positive experiences. I've heard that from many people about choir and about band. Sadly, in junior high school in choir, I was given the task of turning the pages. And actually, I think there is a message that was not my calling. Someone had to turn those pages.
I'm Joe Swaya. I just want to say I really appreciate the book. It's so nuanced, and I'm Joby to the ones who know me from Ludlow, but I grew up with the parents who were involved in that stuff. You really captured the spirit of the times, I think, without glamorizing it, or without sort of idealizing it. And one thing that really struck me was that, it was obvious at the time that, for the most part, and there were exceptions, white people were better off economically. And one of the things that really struck me in your book is you said that, if I got the numbers right, the wealth gap was black people on average had 65% of the wealth of white people at that time. Now it's 35%. And that's just really, that's something really significant. And I just wondered if you could talk more about, the efforts that are going on. Obviously, it's not just a school issue, but to equalize wealth, which is such a big part of the picture.
Yeah. Yes, that's a very. Did you ask anything before I answered? No. Okay.
No, I was just saying, good to see you, Joe. First, congratulations for taking on a very complex issue and your sensitivity, the lens that you brought. Good to see all of you. But here's my question that is very similar to what he's saying. In sports, we did have integration.
We did.
We
played together.
A bond.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in, what did you find when you talked to the white parents that had the courage to engage in this process positively?
All right, those are actually a pretty different questions. So I'm going to take this one first, and then I'll try to answer this question. Okay, so in terms of the wealth gap, you did get those figures about right. The first year I could find in the census where they gave race and income together as one metric was I believe it was 1990, which is when median black income was 65% of median white income. And this is the city of Shaker Heights, so this doesn't include the part of the school district that has the city of Cleveland. So it would probably be lower if you included that part as well. And then by 2020, that had fallen to 35%. So why did that happen? The reason is that the median white income basically stayed about the same. It went up a little bit, but median black income fell. Why was that? It was two things that were happening at the same time. Wealthier black families have left Shaker or chosen not to be in Shaker. Part of that is because there are more opportunities than there used to be. More suburbs are open to them. More suburbs are welcoming. It's easier. There's more choices. Whereas, back in the day, it was Cleveland Heights or Shaker Heights pretty much, and those were your choices. So that's part of the reason. Some black parents talk about the fact they didn't like the racial dynamic in the school. They didn't like the fact that there were a lot of lower achieving black students, and if their kids were higher achieving, they were caught in this place of like, where do I fit? This idea of like, my social group might have one vibe and my academic group another, and it was hard for those kids, and maybe it was better to go to Solon where maybe there aren't very many black kids, but at least you're not caught in the middle like that. At the same time, Shaker Heights has become much more accessible to lower income families. Some of that had to do with the recession and the housing crisis around 2008, 2009, 2010, where you had a lot of properties were foreclosed upon. They were bought by out-of-town land owners who would rent them, they started accepting Section 8 vouchers. So Shaker actually became much more accessible to people who were like outright poor. So in fact, I believe among the black population in Shaker, I think that it's something like just shy of 15% are living in actual poverty. So that's not something that you would have expected or thought about when you think of Shaker Heights of the Cosmo magazine version of this opulent suburban dream. So you have these very different, so on one level, I've really grappled with this, like, some people say, oh, this is horrible, all these poor people are here. But on the other hand, it's like, well, isn't this sort of some degree of justice embedded in that this community that has so many resources that there can be some cross-subsidization and that you can have some economic diversity, like that in some ways is a real positive, but it also presents challenges because just like kids going to the city of Cleveland schools who show up who don't have the same resources and didn't go to science camp, and maybe they don't have all their school supplies the first day the ways another kid would, or all the other things that happen, it's on and on and on. The same thing happens here. So there has been it has grown. At the time when you guys were in high school, and certainly younger, many more of the black families were pretty high achieving, wealthier families, solidly middle class and upper middle class. Certainly the first families to move into Ludlow, that would be accurate description. So it's changed, and that's presented new things. In terms of sports teams, back in the day, they probably were integrated when you were there, but they are less integrated today. I will say, like you do not see, I haven't done a census of every sports team, but this is just what people have told me. I believe that it is true. Was there a second part of your question?
It was more the lens by which.
How do white people see it?
The white families had to engage in this process too.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting because when the first, I did a talk at the library a couple nights ago where I showed some primary source documents I used, and among them were some of the letters in response to the original Shaker Schools Plan in 1970, which was the voluntary busing program. And there were people against it big time. And there's this one letter that I read, which is just stunning how really racist it is. Let's just call it what it is. It's a straight up racist letter saying, like, what are you doing to the schools? I'll never send my kid there. And, but what ended up happening is people with those views in general tended to leave Shaker, and certainly were not drawn to Shaker. So you sort of had this positive loop where the community, as people who were not interested in that left, the people who were interested stayed. The community took on an identity. Like when I was growing up, so I graduated in 1986. When I was growing up, it was like very much something we were waving the flag about. Like, we're an integrated community. We've got this figured out. Isn't this great? The housing office is doing this amazing work. The schools had this voluntary plan. Other people were fighting it in court. We were doing it on our own. And it was always a little more nuanced than that, but there was a lot of pride around those things, and that tended to be, at first the city fought it. Like they were, back in the 60s, the city, the mayor said some horrible things. They talked about, the city officials talked about, let's give back the part of the school system that is in the city of Cleveland. Let's give it back to Cleveland. I mean, not real subtle what they were looking to do there. But that changed as the city took on this new identity as a place that was celebrating integration, and it was not, instead of we're fighting integration, so we're a national leader. That became it was like, if you can't beat them, join them. We're doing this, and we are proud of it. And then people who were interested in that, white people who were interested in that, were drawn to that. The book has some interviews with some white families early on in Ludlow who were specifically looking for an integrated community, and that's why they came to Ludlow. And that, I think, happened in general with the city. Not everybody who moved here is for that reason. But if you go out here, I bet you have $5. Go to Van Aken District right now. Randomly interview somebody, a white person. Why are you here? Why do you live in Shaker? I bet you within the first 2 or 3 things they say will be diversity. Now, whether they always act that way or not, it may be something that can be debated, but that is what draws people here. So that is, so you have it's reinforcing.
We'll take one more question.
Thank you so much. And I'm still reading through it, but I'm thinking about the racism in the classroom and from the teachers, the administrators, the principal. You told a story earlier about the principal saying to that student who's taking typing, and I certainly saw it in my classrooms, not all teachers, but I saw black kids being singled out for disciplinary stuff that the white kids who were the same things weren't getting, lower expectations. And I know that's continued, I'm pretty sure it has, but I didn't read the whole book yet, but I'm wondering if there's any kind of special hiring practices or training of administrators, counselors, and teachers in the Shaker system to kind of raise their awareness and get them, help them work through that.
I just want she does comment on that in her book, and she got, people got pushback, a little upset about having to go through diversity training. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, that was there was one of those, and I can't remember what year it was, but it was a while ago. It was maybe in the 80s or so that there was. Yeah, I found this letter from the teachers union head who was insulted by the idea that they needed to be taught not to be racist. But yes, there has been that kind of training that has happened since then. It's not actually like a big focus from what I can tell today, but there is some of that. There's been some connected with the detracking, some training along those lines of like, how do you do this and how do you deal with a more diverse classroom. So yes, but that's also it's pretty common now in American schools, diverse schools, to have that kind of sort of general DEI work going on.
But does it work?
Well, does it work?
I think it just has to depend.
And I think I'm not prepared to like answer that one way or another, because I'm sure that if I'm sure it does work in some cases and not in others, and sometimes what is working is a very subtle and hard to say, and different people have different points of view. I mean, one of the more painful episodes that's recounted in this book is a recent case of a teacher and an uncomfortable exchange between a teacher and a student that ended with the teacher being suspended and ultimately never coming back, and it ripped this community apart. This was just in 2018, not long ago at all, and I reported some of this in real time. And I don't think that some people would look at that incident and say that this is an example of it not working. Other people would look at it and say there was nothing wrong with what happened there. So it's just, some of this is very much eye of the beholder, and not. That's what I mean by saying like you can't just say this like that's the good teacher and those are the bad teachers. It's just not that simple,
Well, we've come to the close of our conversation, and it's been wonderful. I would like to thank Laura Meckler for visiting with us today. It was a great.
All right, yeah.
I would like to leave our audience with a quote from our guest today. Doing hard things requires planning, preparation, and savvy. Having lived in Washington for a long time, I'm used to people thinking through political obstacles and how to navigate them. I've also seen people of goodwill develop true consensus. Both skills are needed for any school district trying to do hard things. Thank you to the Union Committee for doing a great job, the Shaker School Foundation, John Ingram and James Cananan, who are members of my podcast production team, for technical support, and to everyone for coming out this morning, and everyone have a great day.